Hi, today we're going to learn how to do a 3-wire Fleetmatics standard install. We're going to be taking a Gen X 5P and installing it on a 2012 Dodge Ram. Even though this may not be the vehicle that you have, the principle should be the same for a majority of vehicles out there for light-duty vans, cars. So let's get started. First thing we want to do is we have a wiring harness with just 3-wire. You've got a constant power, an ignition, and a ground. And then you have a bunch of peripherals. I'm going to start off by taping off the extra inputs and outputs to make sure that they're clean and out of the way, like so. Next thing I recommend, even before starting the install, if we've already found where we're going to wire it, put a strip of tape around both fuse holders together along with a zip tie, just as an extra added security. One more thing that I want to point out is mounting. It's going to be a little more of a consideration towards the end of the install, but I want to bring it up now. Fleetmatics uses different units of different shapes and size. We can't really control what you get. One of the installs will generally be the same, but one of the main factors is they have these ridges on them. These ridges are designed to hold on to a zip tie, so if you're mounting to a panel or an air vent or something like that, they won't slide out of the zip tie. You generally want to mount everything high, but secure is a very key factor. Inside the unit there's an accelerometer that can monitor hard braking, hard acceleration, whether you have a feature or not. But you also want a nice solid mount so that your GPS is stable and it's able to pick up as many satellites as possible. The unit we're going to be installing is an internal antenna unit, which means the GPS and cell antenna are both encapsulated in the casing of itself. We do have external antenna units, but they are not external to the vehicle. They're just external to the unit itself. Now, why we use a majority of internal units is because GPS can acquire GPS through glass and through plastic. It just can't through metal. So in this case, where we're going to mount this unit is behind the instrument cluster, with the wiring going down to right around the key switch area. In this case, we're going to remove the bezel that goes around the instrument cluster, and we're going to try to mount the unit up here. In the interest of saving time, I have removed the screws that are holding this in. We just have to pop the panel out. My recommendation is at Harbor Freight has these for about $5. This is a panel puller. It'll less likely to mark your dash. But as you can see here, once the screws are out, majority of everything is just a bunch of pops, and the bezel comes out. Now that we have the dash piece out, you can see there's a big cavity in here with nothing above it. We're generally going to mount the unit somewhere right around in here using either double-sided tape. Ideally, if you would like to go further than that, there are 2 screws, and you can take out the entire cluster and find a location to zip tie it to. Again, interest of time, we're just going to mount it up in here and run the wiring down towards the key switch. So one of the things you need to consider before you start installing is where you're going to mount the unit and where you're going to wire the unit. In this case, because we've already done the research, we know we're going to mount it here, and the wiring for the key switch is right down here. The concern we now have to have is how we're going to get the wiring from the top part to the down part. Let's start by taking the dash apart. Now that we've taken the top part of the panel off, we now need to access the wiring. We will try to find a way to go from the top panel to the bottom panel and have a wiring path for it. Taken off 2 screws underneath, and now we're just going to pop this panel off somewhat gently, but with enough force for it to be removed. Now in here, we have access to our wiring. So we found the key switch, and we've looked up on DirectTex or Bulldog or other free sites that we know that the wiring is here off the back of the key. This is where we're going to start looking. Where we're going to follow our wiring is we're going to zip tie it across here, come up around this way, make sure we stay clean of the install cluster and the steering wheel, and go up to the box. Now it's time to check our wiring and wire up the unit. In this case, you want to take your probe, you want to use a voltmeter and put that to a ground. We looked up the wiring ahead of time, so we're looking for the pink with white for ignition and blue with red. Let's also confirm it. You always want to confirm your wiring. So if we test without poking into the wire, testing the back of the plug, we see that our green and red is showing 12 volts with the key off. We put the key in the ignition and start it. It drops a little bit, but it stays at 12 volts. That's going to be our 12 volt, our constant power. Let's also check our ignition. If we go in the pink and white wire, we find that it's not showing voltage. Key forward 1 is accessory, key forward 2 is ignition. We're getting 12 volts. Looks like the battery in this vehicle might need to be changed, but that is our true ignition. Let's get the ground set up. In this case, we always want to ground this out to the frame somewhere using an eye loop. We do not want to wrap the wire around a screw or anything like that. So let's start by crimping the eye loop onto the ground wire, like so. Make sure you give it a good tug after and make sure it's connected. A good ground plane would be this bracket right here. One thing you want to check is make sure that there's no wires or anything touching behind it. You want to take your eye loop and you want to drill it right in with a self-tapping screw. This is probably the worst thing for vehicle owners to watch. Now that it's in, it's secure, it's not moving, we have a ground. Now let's wire it up. All right, well, let's cut into the wiring. We know that this is our constant and there's our ignition. Now I have cut our wires to length. You don't want to leave the long cable, the long length of cable that comes with it. You want to make sure that you have the shortest amount of point between the fuses and the wiring. Not too short so that if you do decide to sell the vehicle, you got enough room to cut this out and put it on another vehicle. So I use a set of strippers that I got at Radio Shack or Lowe's. I'm going to strip back the wire a little bit. Use a poke tool or even your test probe to open up that wiring inside there and then put our wire through it. Before you go all the way around, make sure you take a pair of needle nose and crimp that wire down to keep the connectivity of the voltage. So I wrap it around a couple times and then grab a piece of tape. I like to use Scotch Super 33, or nice high-end tape. Make sure you wrap it up nice and tight. Then this is not enough. You still have to add a zip tie to each line. Alright, we're going to do the same thing with the ignition wire, and I'll show you when it's done. Alright, so we've wired in our constant and our ignition. We've put a zip tie over either line directly on the tape itself. I've also put a third zip tie over both lines to keep everything kind of snug together. That keeps the wires from pulling out, and it also keeps the tape from unraveling. Next thing we're going to do is I'm going to button up everything. I'll probably zip tie the fuses up here with leaving enough slack on the ground so it doesn't get pulled out in case there's any motion. And then we're going to run all of our wiring up into the box itself. Now that the unit's been wired, let's check to make sure that the box is confirmed. It's blinking slow, which means ignition's off. It's blinking fast with ignition on. At this point, the unit's installed. We want to confirm that it's working. You should have an email with their login, or you might have somebody in the office that has it up right now. Give them a call, go into the office, make sure you write down your license plate, your VIN number, and the odometer. You can go inside, check on Live Fleet, make sure it's working, and then go into the admin section. Make sure that you input your VIN number, your license plate, and your odometer. There's a lot of features that are based off of the current odometer, so inputting it now is very important. Before we mount the unit, let's make sure that everything's secured. As you can see here, I have kind of buttoned up all the fuses, taped them up to make it a little more less obvious of what is in there, and also make sure that someone who is kind of ignorant to how an install looks might not think it's where the GPS wiring is. I followed the path here, going across, zip tied up the excess bundle, and then we have cleared the steering wheel. We know that it's not touching anything towards the linkage or the tilt, and then we're going to put the unit up here. Well, let's mount the dash back on. Make sure that all of the pops, screws, and everything goes in the right direction. A little bit of force to get it back on. Make sure there's no scratches or damage, and then we'll put the two bottom screws on. Alright, the unit has been called in and confirmed working. Let's mount the unit. We're going to go right above the speedometer. Best case scenario is when you can zip tie it to something like a bracket. In this case, we're going to use what's called butyl tape. It's a non-hardening, almost like a putty. Use a little bit on both sides and get it above the cluster. We also make sure that the wiring is completely out of the way so that when we put the bezel back on, there's no interference. see the unit mounted, and then the wiring follows around the speedometer. The last piece of the puzzle goes back on. Again, clips. There are 3 screws here that I'll screw on off camera, but steering wheel tilts. Let's make sure that the vehicle operates. The most important part. Doesn't seem like anything's hanging up on it. The install is done. The vehicle's put back together. One last public service announcement. Make sure you pick up all of your scrap and the vehicle is in the same condition that you had arrived in. Have a good day.